And to begin, welcome to the September 9th History Bites lecture. My name is George Naughton, and this lecture is being brought to you by the Amherst, Massachusetts Historical Society. Today, our speaker is Mr. Blair Kamen, who will speak about the storm and the war that changed Amherst. Mr. Kamen was the Chicago Tribune's architecture critic from 1992 to 2021. He was a graduate of Amherst College and the Yale School of Architecture. He's also been a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 1999 for a body of work highlighted by a series of articles on Chicago's lakefront. And in 2020, he wrote an architectural guide to Amherst College in preparation for Amherst's bicentennial in 2021. Since leaving the Tribune, he's been working on a new collection of his columns, Who is the City For? Architecture, Equity, and the Public Realm in Chicago, which will be published in November, and he's been racing in triathlons. His talk today will explore the genesis of the two most prominent and beloved features of the Amherst College campus, the War Memorial and the main quadrangle. So take it away, Blair Kamen.
Thank you, George. It's really good to be with everybody. All right, can you all see that? Good, okay. Well, I really vividly remember the circumstances surrounding the first talk I gave to the Amherst Historical Society last February, days before Russia had invaded Ukraine. And I think most of us expected Kyiv to fall in a matter of days. Yet here we are, 6 months later, with Ukraine still standing and the world being changed in many ways by that awful war. Wars do that, of course. They disrupt norms. They force us to do things in new ways, sometimes awful and sometimes wonderful. And today I want to talk about one of the better outcomes, specifically Amherst College's War Memorial. Accordingly, I dedicate this talk to the memory of the 142 Amherst men who gave their lives in World War I and World War II. I'm going to introduce you to two of them. I'm also going to introduce you to the little-known landscape architect who shaped the college's War Memorial and its main quadrangle. And I'll provide an overview of how Amherst campus has changed over time, not only because of the world wars, but because of the great New England hurricane of 1938. Here's the overall theme. You cannot understand the special sense of place of the Amherst campus without considering the spaces in between its buildings. A college campus, ideally, is much more than a collection of isolated structures. The spaces in between not only connect the structures, but have a powerful identity all their own, one that profoundly shapes our experiences and lives on in our memories. To fully grasp the beauty of the Amherst campus, in other words, you must come to terms with landscape architecture as well as architecture. So let me begin with these two revered places on campus, the main quadrangle, which is 83 years old, and the War Memorial, which turns 75 in June. Viewed in the chronological context of Amherst's just concluded bicentennial celebration, both the memorial and the main quad are relatively recent additions to the campus. And yet they seem inevitable, timeless, as if they'd been there as long as the softly undulating hills of the Holyoke Range. To an Amherst or a town of Amherst audience, they need no introduction. What I want to do today is reintroduce you to them. How did they come to be? Why are they both simple and complex, at once an integral part of Amherst's daily life, yet also quasi-sacred places where the college enacts some of its most important rituals and rites of passage, from orientation to graduation. Why and how do the main quadrangle and the War Memorial speak to us today? It turns out that these campus landmarks have their roots in headline-making events that transpired in less than 12 months. The Great New England Hurricane, which struck the college on September 21st, 1938, and the beginning of World War II, when German troops invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. These traumatic events had an enormous impact on the campus, but their built legacy was anything but tragic. In each case, Amherst transformed something cataclysmic, violent, and deadly into something beautiful, meaningful, and exquisitely peaceful. The story of how that happened begins with the beginning of Amherst College in the 1830s. Amherst College Row follows the precedent of Yale's Old Brick Row, a cluster of physically separate but visually connected brick buildings. The Greek Revival Johnson Chapel is at its center. Plain-spoken Federal-style buildings, north and south halls, occupy the flanks. Compared to the Yale Row and its elaborate cross-top cupolas, Amherst Row is a model of Greek Revival simplicity and austerity. Its great advantage is its site, not the flats of the New Haven Green, but a steeply pitched slope that transforms the row into an academic acropolis, what you would call a templed hill, like the one celebrated in the second verse of the song, "My Country 'Tis of Thee. I love thy rocks and rills, thy woods and templed hills." It's significant that the Amherst Row faced outward to the west toward the town green and the Connecticut River, which was the interstate highway of its day. The westward orientation advertised the fledgling college to the outside world. Unlike separate standalone buildings, the row communicated institutional strength. It suggested a hilltop citadel, perhaps designed to repel an attack from students of a rival, highly overrated college set in the wilds of the Berkshire Hills. In contrast to the proud western turning face of College Row, Johnson Chapel turned its back to the east. There was no quad there, just a forest, which served as a source of firewood for Amherst's original cadre of about 50 students. The back of the chapel didn't get a suitable Greek Revival facade for another 100 years. Before that, as you can see in the image on the left, it resembled nothing so much as the side of a barn. Put another way, the chapel had a Queen Anne front and a Mary Anne behind. The preeminence of the old row was disrupted in the 1870s when Amherst hired the great landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, co-designer of New York Central Park, to find a place for a new college church. Olmsted turned that simple task into a visionary exercise. He proposed that Amherst reorient itself inward around a quadrangle with the college church at its center. And you can see that right there where the arrow is pointing. Amherst clearly was no fan of College Row or of Amherst Town Center. In 1870, he wrote to the college's president, William Stearns, "Disencumber your plans from regard to the few buildings which awkwardly dovetail the college to the village. Cut loose from the village as well as the Connecticut River and build the college up by itself about a center of its own." Amherst did not follow the letter of Olmsted's plan, but it did follow the spirit. The college church, a picturesque Victorian Gothic building, was built where the Mead Art Museum now stands. By the 1880s, the main quadrangle looked like this. Note the curving pathways, very picturesque and Olmstedian. Here is the barn-like backside of Johnson Chapel. Note too, the tower right here, now demolished atop Williston Hall. Then there's the Gothic Revival, Walker Hall, where the Frost Library now stands. And then there's the aforementioned College Church, the only remnant of which is Stern's steeple. I call your attention especially to the College Grove, an alley of maple trees running on an east-west axis across the quad. By linking chapel and church, the grove aptly symbolized the dominant role that religion still played at Amherst College. Indeed, Amherst architecture was dominated by the elaborately decorated, evocatively ecclesiastical Gothic style, what President Stearns termed Christian aesthetics. This is what the grove looked like on the left. Those maples, as you can see, framed a view of the college church and the Noah Webster Memorial, a tribute to Amherst's most prominent founder. The middle path at Kenyon College, which survives, and you can see it on the right, suggests the powerful visual presence of the old grove and its capacity to stir the soul. But the rise of classical architecture, exemplified by the Renaissance Revival masterpiece of Fairweather Hall, portended another disruption when that building, Fairweather, was completed in 1894. That disruption was a reaction against the picturesque design principles of the Victorian age. I'm representing them here with the cluttered Victorian parkland between the Capitol and the Washington Monument that existed in 1892. Instead, the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago introduced a new City Beautiful style of urban planning. It prioritized harmonious clusters of classical buildings and monumental axes, accentuated by views of distant landmarks. The Chicago Fair's influence could be felt almost 10 years later in the Macmillan Plan for Washington, D.C. That plan, which you see here, was the blueprint for transforming the once cluttered Victorian landscape into the National Mall we know today. Now, this was the aesthetic ideal that one of the designers of the Washington Plan, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., had in mind when he wrote Amherst Leaders in 1925. His point in this letter was that it would be best to get rid of the College Grove. But in light of the sentiment and tradition attached to the grove, Olmsted predicted that removal never could be attempted, quote, unless some calamity should destroy all the trees at one fell swoop. Those were prescient words. In light of the very stormy weather on the rainy morning of September 21st, 1938, President Stanley King and his wife, Margaret King, moved a welcoming party for the class of 1942 from the garden at the president's house to the inside of nearby College Hall. A very wise move, given that an unwelcome guest was about to intrude. The Great New England Hurricane of 1938, also known as the September Surprise and the Long Island Express, began as a Category 5 hurricane in the Caribbean. When it made landfall, it roared through Long Island and Connecticut. It upended houses and boats. It killed hundreds. By the time it reached Western Massachusetts, the storm was less powerful, but still lethal. It caused flooding along the Connecticut River, and when it barreled into Amherst, it tore down hundreds of trees, including the beloved maples of the old College Grove, as well as other trees near Walker Hall. Meanwhile, back at College Hall, what did President King do as this disaster unfolded? Did he ask the incoming freshmen to take cover in the basement? No. Did he tell them to stay away from the windows as broken glass, roof shingles, and broken tree limbs were flying around outside? No. The president and Mrs. King continued to shake hands with their guests. WASP decorum prevailed, and the day passed into legend to be recounted from one Amherst generation to another. After I gave this talk last year, Bruce Johnson, class of 1970, emailed to let me know that his father, Fred, was among the class of 1942 freshmen being entertained by the Kings that day. He went on, "Dad told me that after the storm had passed, President King said to the freshmen, 'You will clear the debris from the campus.' And so they did, and forever after called themselves the Hurricane class." Well, after the debris was cleared, what was the college to do? Rebuild the old grove? Obviously not. As Olmsted Jr. had anticipated, the hurricane gave Amherst the cover it needed to break free and build a more perfect campus. But with relations between the college and the Olmsted firm having deteriorated, Amherst instead called on a landscape architect whom I suspect most of you have never heard of, Arthur Shircliffe. Shircliffe had begun his career in 1896 working for Frederick Law Olmsted. He set up his own shop in 1904. By the time the hurricane hit, he already had drawn national attention for his reinterpretations of colonial American landscape design, especially at Colonial Williamsburg. Shircliffe's other works show his considerable skill and impact. They include the great public space of Boston's Charles River Esplanade, a campus plan for Mount Holyoke College, and the administrative complex at Quabbin Reservoir. It turns what could have been a utilitarian eyesore into something with the neo-Georgian grace you see at Harvard. In the 1930s, Shircliffe also designed the Paul Revere Mall in Boston's North End. It reveals his fondness for formality, symmetry, and strong geometric features. In remaking the quad, I should note, Shircliffe was assisted by Amherst official campus architect, James Kellum Smith of the vaunted firm of McKim, Mead and White. Mead, I should say, was an Amherst graduate. Smith's Amherst works range from the Moore Dormitory of 1929, originally a chemistry building, to Chapin Hall of 1958, still a religion building. Moore is a distinguished effort, solid, not flashy, much like the suits that Brooks Brothers used to make. Chapin, on the other hand, is utterly undistinguished, resembling nothing so much as a Howard Johnson's. When it was under construction, students actually protested its banal design, throwing dirt back into the foundation hall that bulldozers had dug. Later, as construction proceeded, a WAG student spray painted Chapin's incomplete tower with the word and numerals 28 flavors. But I digress. Let's go back to the aftermath of the Great Hurricane. By the spring of 1939, the quad had been regraded. About 85 large trees were planted: white pine, red oak, white oak, rock maple, elm, and beech, all native to the Connecticut River Valley. They were arranged in straight rows that ran north-south, not east-west like the old grove. The orientation drew the eye to the distant view of the Holyoke Range, in keeping with the planning principles of the City Beautiful movement. But if you look closely, you can see another organizing principle, the plan of a Gothic cathedral with its dominant main aisle and more intimate side aisles. That's the way the quad is laid out, a cathedral of trees, if you will. There's a big open space at the center and rows of trees on its flanks. That comparison rang true in the quad's naked, nascent form in 1939, when its trees were like those in a freshly built suburban subdivision. And it still rings true with the trees fully grown, their leaves providing soothing shade, and the grass cascading downward from Johnson Chapel. You see the intimate side aisles, shaded and just right for sitting in an Adirondack chair. And you see the expansive main aisle, flexible enough to host an outdoor class, a game of ultimate frisbee, or the ritual of commencement. The main quadrangle then would never have happened without the great New England hurricane. And just for fun, I'd like to point out another legacy of the storm relevant to the town of Amherst, the nickname of the Amherst Regional High School sports teams, the Hurricanes. It's not exactly what you'd expect from a school more than 100 miles from hurricane-prone Cape Cod. And yet, the hurricane and its legacy are only half of our story. In a cathedral, after all, the long space of the nave leads somewhere to an altar. It is an architecture we experience in time as well as space, an architecture in which the moving human body matters nearly as much as the space through which it moves. Architects call this concept procession, referring to how we move or process through space, which leads us to the second calamity that changed the Amherst campus, the Second World War. A little more than 2 years after leading the D-Day invasion that would liberate Europe from Hitler's grip, General Dwight D. Eisenhower visited the college for a conference. While there, he viewed the completed War Memorial, which honors the 34 Amherst men killed in World War I and the 108 who died in World War II. Here is one of those who gave their lives in the First World War, Merrill Stanton Gaunt, Amherst class of 1914, and later a student at the Andover Theological Seminary, which was affiliated with Harvard's Divinity School. In 1916, Gaunt sailed for Europe, joining a group of Harvard men who served as volunteer ambulance drivers for the French Army. According to his class notes in the publication that then served as the Amherst Alumni Magazine, Gaunt saw a little over 2 weeks of active service near Verdun in Northeast France and worked with little or no rest. His exhausted state made him vulnerable to infection from soldiers wounded by shrapnel. He died of cerebrospinal meningitis on March 30th, 1916, near Bar-le-Duc, France, the first Amherst man to die in World War I. He was 23 years old. Other Amherst men would follow in Gaunt's footsteps, and those, incidentally, of Ernest Hemingway, who served as an ambulance driver in Italy and was badly wounded there. Once America entered the war in 1917, a group of Amherst students formed an ambulance unit called the Black Cats. They drove converted Model T Fords. You see their logo on the right, an angry cat with an arched back and an upright tail, a tongue-in-cheek symbol of bad luck. After the end of the war to end all wars, Amherst inscribed the names of its World War I dead in gold on the walls of the Converse Memorial Library, now Converse Hall. They appeared beneath this inscription in French, "Tout ce que nous avons est à vous," which means, in essence, all that we have is due to your sacrifice. But parents of some of the dead felt bitterly about the college's failure to do more. World War II provided a chance to rectify this failing and to more fittingly recognize the sacrifices made by Amherst men like Guy-André Lévy d'Espace, who already had been honored in a 1943 memorial near his Chi Phi fraternity house. Lévy d'Espace was the only son of a mother descended from French aristocrats and a Jewish father who was known as the Coca-Cola King of France. Perhaps because Levi de Spa was half Jewish, he and his mother fled to Canada when the Nazis threatened to overtake France. They lived in Montreal before the son enrolled at Amherst. Then the son left in 1940 to join the 603rd Squadron of the Royal Canadian Air Force. Levi de Spa was shot down and killed over Malta in 1942. He was 20 years old. For the college, the key questions prompted by the possibility of a new war memorial were these: where would it go and what should it look like? One day, as the war raged on and President King walked around the campus's southern edge, inspiration struck. To the southeast, King later wrote, was the beautiful expanse of Hitchcock Field, where companies of soldiers were then drilling. To the southwest, the impressive mass of our physical education buildings. But directly in front of me were some 5 acres of wild land, ungraded, unused, and awaiting development. There I saw was our war memorial, right at my feet. Memorial Field, beautifully framed and commanding the finest prospect the college had. I could see it crowded with students on an afternoon in spring or autumn, and I knew that as long as the college remained, its young men of each generation would need outdoor playing fields. The particular games they played might change from decade to decade, but they would always play competitive games out of doors. But the spectacular sight of the War Memorial was hardly a guarantee of its success. The memorial could have lapsed into man on horseback triumphalism, like the statue of Civil War General John Logan in Chicago, or it could have been done in the prosaic literalism that tries to evoke the tension of men in battle, as you see in the Korean Veterans War Memorial in Washington. Instead, Shircliffe and James Callum Smith, the architect, joined forces for something very different. Not an abstract memorial like Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial, but a design that reduces classical forms to their geometric essence. Shircliffe's Paul Revere Mall in Boston from the 1930s probably served as a model. Note the mall's central open space, flanked by rows of trees, the circular stone fountain in the middle distance, and the spire of Old North Church in the far distance. Here's a view in the opposite direction with St. Stephen's Church drawing the visitor forward. And so Amherst Memorial took shape with a circular granite slab in place of the fountain in Shircliffe's Paul Revere Mall. And the memorial also took place, of course, with the extraordinary view of the Holyoke Range, especially the notch providing the distant focal point. The result is a stirring 3-part sequence that forms the heart of the Amherst campus. First, the linear space of the quadrangle leads the eye to the War Memorial. Second, the memorial is compressed by the buildings flanking it, Webster and Sealy Mud, which was built after the memorial. And then that compression accentuates the third and climactic part of the sequence, the grand expanse of Memorial Field and the view beyond. Architects call this type of sequence compression, tight here, and release, open here. As much as the grand design, the details are crucial. The steps leading from the quad down to the memorial don't only honor the dead, they form a special transition from one area of the campus to another, a precinct that is both connected to the quad and a zone unto itself. As you stand on the threshold of this precinct, a series of elements underscore the shift. The grove of pine trees and their distinctive scent differentiate the memorial from the more varied tree palette of the main quad. The ground plane is not grass, but paved bluestone. The granite slab is circular, a geometry not typically found on Amherst's predominantly right-angled campus. Significantly, the circular slab interrupts the straight line path of the pedestrian. forcing a slight detour. We slow down. The business and busyness of the everyday recede. We notice things. The design facilitates that interaction. The circular block, as you can see, is only 19 inches high, making it easy for the passerby to stop and read the names of the dead. The names are arranged in 13 concentric circles, representing the original 13 states. 48 stars ring the block, symbolizing the number of states at the time of World War II. The compass points suggest that Amherst men fought in every theater of war. They even seem to lock the memorial into a vast cosmic order, as if it were a sundial. The truncated obelisks that ring the memorial with their 5 pointed military stars and the bluntness of the granite benches, each inscribed with the name of a theater of war, evoke lives cut short. Yet there are also signs of eternal life, like the flowers that bloom on the shrubs each spring. What isn't there is as crucial as what is there. There are no human figures, no false attempts to portray men in battle. And there are no vertical elements on the main axis, allowing the eye to run uninterrupted from the main quad to the Holyoke Range. The guiding aesthetic impulse is modesty, not the monumentality typically associated with the City Beautiful movement. It is significant, too, that the memorial honors the dead of both wars in a single composition and places their names in concentric circles displayed horizontally. That arrangement is very different from the smaller memorials dedicated to fraternity brothers, which are more like vertical plaques attached to a wall. The arrangement suggests that the dead were part of an epic-defining collective struggle, and that the two world wars ultimately comprised a single and singular project. And yet, individual identity is respected. Here, as you can see, is the name of the World War II victim I discussed earlier, Guy Lévy Despas, with the year he left Amherst, 1940. Others are identified by the year of their graduating class. That would allow their fellow class members to point and say, he was in my class, he was in my fraternity, I knew that guy, a direct personal connection. Architectural history lends additional resonance to the memorial. With its circular geometry, hillside location, and a view to a spectacular natural panorama, the design owes something to the precedent of ancient Greek theaters. Yet this is a theater of remembrance rather than a theater of performance. It is a place for contemplation, not celebration. It emphasizes service and sacrifice, not victory and its spoils. Departing from Olmsted's vision for an internalized quadrangle, the memorial turns Amherst's inward-looking campus outward toward the world and a broad reinterpretation of the college's original evangelizing impulse. It is at once a sanctuary and a threshold to the world beyond, where the distant view invites internal reflection as well as expansive thought. It remains the noblest expression of Amherst's highest ideals. The memorial also brings the college's architecture full circle, back to the Greek Revival roots of Johnson Chapel. The chapel is a Greek Revival solid, evoking ancient Greek temples. The memorial is a Greek Revival void, evoking ancient Greek theaters. The two exemplify the wisdom of Yale architectural historians' famous definition of architecture, a continuing dialogue between the generations, which creates an environment developing across time. Now, all memorials face a common problem. Will they still resonate after war veterans die and memories fade? To the current generation of Amherst students, World War II may seem as distant as the Civil War was to my generation. Great memorials must transcend their times. That, after all, is what remembering is all about. It's suggested by the Latin root mem, the linguistic building block for innumerable English words, from commemorate to memorandum. In some cases, memorials take on new meanings that become layered onto their original ones. Yet rather than diluting the original intent, the new meanings enrich the memorials with new memories. Think of the Lincoln Memorial. This monument to national unity, dedicated in the 1920s, was subsequently transformed into a symbol of the struggle for racial equality, first by Marian Anderson in the 1930s, then by Martin Luther King in the 1960s. Changing times and attitudes have also had an impact on the War Memorial at Amherst. When I arrived on campus in the fall of 1975, the memorial was less than 30 years old, and the tumult of the Vietnam War was still deeply felt, represented by the arrest of Amherst President John William Ward at Westover Air Force Base just 3 years earlier. To many in the Vietnam era, the words pro patria, for country, and Amherst men gallantly responded to their country's call, surely rang hollow. It was not as if the memorial was unappreciated in the 1970s. Perhaps it was underappreciated. At that point, it occupied that strange purgatory of buildings that have yet to turn 50. They're too new to be old and too old to be new. But attitudes change. Nearly half a century later, Amherst Alumni Magazine proudly featured the college's first ROTC member in 20 years on its cover. The September 11 attacks may have been the crucial turning point. The memorial, 55 years old in 2001, became a place of refuge and remembrance for those reeling from the attacks. In later years, it became the site of events marking the anniversary of 9/11, including ceremonies devoted to the 3 Amherst victims of the attacks. Today, the memorial has evolved from its original time-specific purpose to a timeless symbol of the college. In a series of pandemic-era photographs, faculty member George Chiao, forgive me for mispronouncing his last name, used it as a backdrop to represent the universal virtues of family, long-lasting love, a father's devotion to his son, not a Madonna and child, but a Papa and child, a father cradling his son and wishing perhaps that he will never be sent to war. The power of free speech and protest is commemorated too. And there's a reminder that despite the victories of the 2 world wars, the struggle to achieve a more perfect union is never ending. Ultimately, the memorial has come to transcend its original purpose and become firmly, poignantly associated with many things, as Kathy Shaw asserts in this observation she emailed to me after one of my talks last year. It's associated with personal reflection, contemplation, turning inward to the psyche and the heart, as well as outward to the hills. By the way, just a historical note, that is me in 1973 or 74. That's a shot taken by the Daily Hampshire Gazette. I was kind of anticipating this talk. There I was reading and enjoying my own contemplation at the War Memorial many, many years ago. But as Kathy says, a professor from architecture school used to wax poetic about the sympathetic relationship between paths and places. And it's so interesting to see how a place embedded in a path can work so beautifully. So none of this would have happened without 2 calamities, or without a design that simultaneously recalls the austere architecture of Amherst's earliest days and put new crowning touches on the college's already magnificent landscape. No tour of Amherst architecture is complete without an understanding of that landscape, and no understanding of the landscape is complete without recognizing the towering events that changed the college, as well as the designers who magnificently transformed its campus. Thank you very much.
Maybe you should stop your screen share so that we can see more of the people. We have time for question answer. You can put a question in chat. I have to say that when you started out talking about the spaces between being very important, and combine that with the minimalism of the war memorial, it makes me think of Japanese art and architecture.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you can comment on that. Was that intentional on your part?
Well, yes and no with minimalism. And let me just go back to screen share because let me see if I can do this. Because I often get questions about the asking me to compare and contrast the Amherst War Memorial with a real example of minimalism, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. So you can see that both of them are site specific. As I've already told you about the site specificity of the Amherst Memorial, Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial is cut into the earth with both of its ends facing conventional memorials, the Lincoln and the memorial and the Washington Monument. It's different, however, because its language is truly abstract. In other words, the Amherst War Memorial takes classical language and reduces it to its essence, whereas the Vietnam Veterans Memorial takes minimalism to the nth degree. The wall, you can see, is a reflective granite, not the conventionally finished granite of the Amherst War Memorial. And that dematerializes the wall itself. So it becomes reflective. We can see our images in it. And it's a little easier to interact with than the Amherst Memorial. You wouldn't really want to sit on the Amherst War Memorial, but you were invited to touch the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And of course, people do. They leave flowers there, et cetera. So I wouldn't say that the Amherst Memorial is minimal, but I would say that, as the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is, but it's reductive. In other words, it takes classical architecture, often quite ornamental, and reduces it, boils it down to its geometric essence.
Who was it who said that, who was the artist who said simplicity is complexity resolved?
I don't know, but that is a fitting description of the Amherst War Memorial. Absolutely.
Well, we can look up the quote. I mean, I remember that from somewhere. And when you mentioned the Black Cats of Amherst, we do have a video. I haven't checked, what the date is, but the Amherst Historical Society does have a video presentation by, I think he's a third generation black kitten. That's his word. And he wanted to talk about the special role that Amherst students and college professors played driving ambulances in World War I.
Absolutely.
Are there other questions? Eileen Wood.
Yeah, I have heard, well, another striking thing about that memorial and that view, you don't see any houses in the distance.
Yes.
And we know that there are lots of people living in that space. And I heard that Amherst looked ahead to preserving that view and buying up that property. And I just think that that's a really interesting kind of and visionary sort of thing that they did that. And
you're absolutely right. Amherst did that. They bought land just to the south of War Memorial Field and thereby shielded that view, preserved that view from all the stuff that's there now. what is it? Just south of the hockey rink? Isn't there like some? You tell me. Along Route 116, what's there? It's some like almost like there was like some kind of factory, or I can't remember what. But yeah, it really would have marred that gorgeous panorama if the college hadn't thought ahead. So they did the right thing. It really would have been a very different experience if they hadn't acted with such foresight.
Nancy Eddy, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I have to chime in on that piece, which is really interesting. I think actually that's the Amherst DPW, that is the building that you're thinking of.
Thank you.
But I was a resident on Mill Lane, and I benefited from the fact that, in fact, after my little ranch house on that street was built, the college bought all that land and bought all the land in back of those houses on Mill Lane. So we were very appreciative to the college because we enjoyed the open space as well.
So yeah, well, there you go. There's an example of good town-gown relations, very different from the People's Republic of Cambridge, where it is blood sport for Cambridge residents to defeat anything that evil Harvard proposes.
Okay, I see something in the Google chat that was Constantine Brancusi who said simplicity is complexity resolved.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So Brancusi, now we know. Ken Rosenthal has his hand up.
Thanks, George. Excuse me. And thank you, Blair. One other comment about the view.
Sure.
The view at the time the War Memorial was built has one feature that doesn't exist now if you look at the Holyoke Range, and that is a knob in the middle of the Holyoke Range that has been quarried away over the last 70 years.
Wow.
And it's trap rock mostly, and it's probably under most of our roads in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and other New England areas. And if you look at you had one picture which looked out across and showed the range at that time, and you can see that knob. All the other pictures are recent, and it's just a flat line.
Here, let's see if we can go back to it. Hold on a sec. You know, something else that's there, of course, is the bunker. You all know what that is, right?
Yeah.
The bunker was there we go. So Ken, is it somewhere in there? Is that the area that's been?
I think a little to your right.
To the right.
Right.
Keep going.
Farther over.
Keep going.
Farther over.
Keep going.
Farther over. Right there.
Stop. Right there.
That doesn't exist now. That little knob.
Really?
Yeah, that was called Little Bear Mountain, I think.
Okay.
There was Bear Mountain and there was Little Bear.
Okay. Well,
And
that's learn something new every day. Ken, thanks, Ken. That's great. I mean, also somewhere in this panorama, you know, during the Cold War, with Westover, you know, Amherst was the Department of Defense or whoever it was, built a secondary command post in case there was a nuclear strike on Offutt Air Force Base in near Omaha, Nebraska. And so that's how the bunker, that backup command post, was located up in the hills, and it now is a 5-college library depository where the 5 colleges store their extra stuff. So another legacy of war, but in this case, a Cold War.
And I also heard that one reason they built Route 116 the way they did in the 1960s was in case the president had to get to that bunker and Westover was out of commission, you would have a long straight runway, which does have some overpasses. So I don't think this was ever a serious possibility. I think it's one of those urban folk tales. But
to me, Route 16 is, you know, firmly associated with Atkins Farms and cider donuts, much more than Westover Air Force Base. But that's just me.
Ken, do you still have your hand up?
Yes, at the top of the range was a point where the bunker could communicate with Westover Air Force Base.
Hmm.
And there was a tower there, and it had a fence around it. And on that fence was a sign, and it was the sign had an impossible instruction, because what it said is, if you were a hiker and you crossed the range and came upon that sign and that tower, which doesn't exist now, the sign said, "It is forbidden to enter upon, remain upon, or leave these premises without the permission of the commander, Westover Air Force Base." So you couldn't stay there, you couldn't leave there either. And that's what it said. Nancy, you may have made that hike.
Catch 22, right? Perfect.
The military-minded work.
Oh, that's great. That's really funny. Thanks, Ken.
And I have to thank you for the close-up of your 1885 map of Amherst.
Yeah.
I've seen copies of that map online, and it's always fun to trace down, where the Dickinson House is and so on. But
Yeah.
I often get confused around Amherst campus, and you've pointed out it's because the campus has changed so much.
Oh, yeah. I mean, here, I'll call it up again. It's astonishing, the differences. I mean, here, let's go back to it. Yeah.
There.
I mean, wow. It's like, so, I mean, the college is really interesting because it has faced in different directions, that were sort of the prime directions. Like at first, as I mentioned, it faced westward toward the Connecticut River and the town. But then later in the 19th century, it really turned northward with its kind of Gothic skyline, with Walker Hall, with Stearns Church, and then Williston. That they at that point, Victorian Amherst was ashamed of these mill-like original buildings. Johnson Chapel was even painted green and different shades of green to kind of Victorianize it and make it harmonize with the polychromatic architecture of Stearns Church, just ghastly. And then Olmsted wanted the quadrangle to face eastward toward the railroad tracks. And now, to a great extent, the college faces southward toward Memorial Hill and, toward the Holyoke Range. There's Memorial Hill. That's the prime spot everyone goes to. The new campus center is going to be built. This is, by the way, oh gosh, I'm blanking on it, Pratt, the Pratt Gym, which is now a dorm. And then the new campus center is going to be built roughly right here on the site of the Merrill Science Center. And again, the southward orientation. So the different orientations of the college have always been, have changed, even though the campus itself seems kind of timeless and unchanging. In each case, they reflect different attitudes and different aesthetic priorities.
Are there other questions, comments? Okay, well, I think that may wrap it up. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. I've always been interested in architecture. I've never studied it, and to hear you explicate, what goes into, the rows of trees for the quadrangle and so on is just fascinating to me.
Thank you, George. It's really my pleasure.